Hi there. This is Steve Kimes with MennoNerds, and we're here talking with Phileena Heuertz, who is author of Pilgrimage of a Soul and founder or co-founder of Gravity. And she has a new book, a book which I'm really actually has meant a lot to me, called Mindful Silence: The Heart of Christian Contemplation. We were just talking a little bit that actually my background is involved a lot of activism and a lot of working with the houseless in Portland, Oregon, and other things like that. And I went through I went through a burnout myself and all that. And so your book kind of really speaks to that and really spoke to me. And I really appreciate that. That's really wonderful. So Phileena, now I know that for many years you traveled around the world and helping different kinds of people and helping children. What is that? What kind of work were you involved in at that point?
Yeah, so for the first 20 years of my adulthood, I worked in this international nonprofit serving among survivors of trafficking, children with HIV and AIDS, and former child soldiers, war brides, and we were establishing communities to respond to these kinds of desperate needs. And my work really involved traveling to each of the communities, offering support and organizational development, community support. So we were working in 13 cities around the globe, like South and Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, West Africa, South America, and there were about 300 of us doing that work.
300. Wow. Okay. I didn't know that. So were you and your husband, were you overseeing that, or you guys were just part of that community?
Yeah, we were overseeing it. We co-directed it. So there was another founder, and when he stepped down, we inherited the work and kind of grew it from there. So it was our baby.
Okay. Wow, that's really huge. That is
Mm.
actually really huge. And then at one point, you visited Freetown, Sierra Leone, and you talked about how you had kind of a stunning experience there. What did you see there?
Yeah, that was really a turning point for me. It was at the peak of the war over blood diamonds. I believe it was in 2002, and a few of us visited to see how our community might be able to respond. And I met a number of war brides, young girls who'd been conscripted into the war as domestic and sexual slaves. And the city at that time had just recently been liberated, and so there were the city of Freetown was completely war torn, and the displaced people and these young girls were living in UN peacekeeping camps, in tents, and it was just horrific conditions that they were living in, and the young girls were completely traumatized and wanted to share their story. So I spent a day listening to story after story about their suffering. And as they were sharing with me what these soldiers had done to them, I naturally became very judgmental and angry, and wanted justice for these girls. And I had imagined these soldiers to be such monsters for what they had done to these young women. And the next day, our host invited us then to visit a camp for young soldiers who'd recently been disarmed. And like the young girls, they too wanted to share their story. And these boys were nothing like I imagined them to be. They were as young as 5, as old as 23, living
Hmm.
in rags, and many of them had no shoes. And they were also traumatized, and they had also been victims, and they now were facing so much guilt and shame over what they had done. And in this experience, I was confronted with such extreme contradictions of who is good and who is bad, and what is right and what is wrong. And I came to the limits of myself in terms of some of these paradigms of making sense of the world were no longer working. And this was the beginning of what I understand to be a crisis of faith that that really plunged me into the contemplative tradition of spirituality.
And so at that point, there was a man named Father Thomas. And maybe tell me, who is Father Thomas? What does he
Yeah.
do? Where's he at?
Yeah. So after this visit to Freetown, which was so jarring for me and was kind of the pinnacle of coming to the limits of myself and my worldview and my religious paradigms, I could no longer really go to church. The prayer practices that had sustained me up to that point had really fallen short. They weren't working for me anymore. Um, I had huge questions about ultimate reality, about God, about goodness, and so I went into this period of a couple of years of real darkness, spiritual darkness, and was struggling. And so then I ended up meeting Father Thomas Keating, who was a Trappist Cistercian monk, and he lived in Snowmass, Colorado, for many years. He just recently passed away in November. He was like 96, I believe. But he came to
Oh, I
Omaha,
didn't know
Nebraska.
that.
Yeah, he came to Omaha, Nebraska when I think it was 2004. And my husband's spiritual director at the time invited us to meet him and have dinner with him. And then he introduced us to the Christian contemplative tradition and a path or a practice called centering prayer, which is a form of meditation in the Christian tradition. And it was just like I mean, I just took to the practice like a bee to honey. It was like I finally found a way to continue to nurture my faith and my spirituality in a way that could kind of hold me through those dark seasons of the journey and help me to connect with God in a new way. Since my previous practices had fallen short.
And so how is it that helped you? I mean, you talk about the experience that you had at Sierra Leone and having a different idea of who, quote, the bad guys are, and how it is to help the world. How is it that contemplative prayer ended up helping you reach a kind of a balance with that, with what you have experienced?
Yeah. So, you know, the story is that and I tell this in detail in the book, but after that jarring experience in Freetown, I came back to Omaha and was recalling these experiences around my dining table with a friend. And she asked me, "Do you ever doubt the goodness of God?" And given what I had witnessed, and I had been, this was a cumulative effect as well, having worked in the world of poverty for many years. Um, and but at that moment, just trying to deal with all that I had been exposed to in Freetown, when she asked me if I doubted the goodness of God, it was like this dam broke in me, and it was a confession of yes, absolutely, I am doubting the goodness of God for the first time in my life. And I grew up in Middle America. My father was a pastor. I went to church 3 times a week. I took my faith very seriously, and I was out serving people in poverty because of my faith and my ideas of God. And so this was completely devastating. So then when I came into the practice of centering prayer, I found a way to sit in this like raw honesty of my big questions and my doubts about God. It was like the practice had room for me to be with what is, as awful as it may seem, and as turbulent and troubling as it was for me in those days. And then over time, what happened was, not only were my wounds and my pain about the situation in Freetown and the injustices around the world, not only were those met in some spiritual way, but then I began to, it was like this excavation of kind of an excavation of revealing other wounds, and what Father Thomas calls like wounds of a lifetime, like these childhood wounds that we all end up experiencing, and we develop a way to cope, which is a way of developing our personality. And so through this process of centering prayer, there was a meeting of God in a new way, so that not it's not a rational necessarily intellectual or like an assent of knowledge about God, but it was an experience in my body, in my psyche, that God is good because I'm encountering God in this healing effect that was taking place in me.
That's interesting. So you're saying that you are going out and acting in the world and doing good as best you can. That was basically on the basis of belief or on faith. And then once you entered into centering prayer, into contemplation, then all of a sudden you're having a experience, a relationship with God, so that way you could experience His goodness instead of it just being something that you took on faith.
Man, that's a really great way to put it. You really captured, I think, what I've experienced and what I've come to know. And so then it's like, so now, yeah, a lot of things haven't changed in the world, and there's still a lot of suffering, and there's human brutality, and that's all there. But somehow I have like greater capacity to be with that pain, and to experience or find God's goodness within it.
So, but what about the basic idea? If God is powerful and God is loving, so how does this help you reconcile that with the amazing levels of suffering that you have seen?
Yeah. Well, my whole image of God has shifted so much over time that it's like I don't imagine God to be a being out there that is pulling strings or orchestrating things in such a way that like God is either involved or not involved. But instead I find God in the relationship of life. So to be with people in poverty and suffering, yes, that's horrible. And my questions years ago were, if God is good, then why do these bad things happen? I don't have those same questions anymore. Now it's a question of, where is God in the midst of this suffering? And how can we experience God right here, right now, in the midst of this, no matter how horrible it is? So it's a different orientation of an approach to life, and it's a different kind of posture toward what we imagine God to be.
So, oh man, I've got so many questions going on in different ways. So, and if I'm overstepping my bounds, you let me know. But so what about people who would critique you, saying, well, this is just a cop-out, so that way you don't have to do the actions that are necessary to do in the world, that you're using God as a way of stepping back, so that way you're not involved in helping the people who desperately need help.
Yeah, I could see how someone might hear what I'm saying and find like an excuse for uninvolvement, but in my experience, it's had the opposite effect, that it has allowed me to be even more involved in a way that is aligned with what I can actually contribute, what I can actually do, like what is mine to do, because I can't do it all. I can't fix it all. I can't heal all these problems in the world, but I can, through contemplation and discernment, determine with freedom what is mine to do to contribute to the healing of the world. And that's just a subtle, slight difference. And to me, it resonates with the wisdom teaching of Jesus that says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." You know, the challenges ahead of us are immense, but when we find a way to be aligned with really our truest, highest self, aligned with what we understand to be the will of God, the particular will of God in my life, then that aligns with the the corporate global will of God, and I can actually do something to be effective. And for me, what that has meant is starting Gravity, a center for contemplative activism, to help more people wake up to this kind of consciousness so that they can be freed into their particular contribution in the healing of the world.
How do you see Gravity, your organization, creating a balance between one's spiritual life and one's activism?
Yeah, you know, the way I see it, and we've been at this work now 7 years, so it's still new, but what I'm seeing is that the people that we're working with are actually very active people. They're very concerned about justice and about healing and freedom for some of the greatest concerns of our time. Uh, but many of them, so the piece that's missing is the contemplative or the contemplation aspect of their life. And so what happens is that we may be very well intended in our action in the world, and all the while there may be some good that we're contributing, but oftentimes there's a lot of fallout from that, either personally with our health and our well-being, or in our family, or our relationships sometimes suffer because of our well-meaning intentions to make the world a better place. And so the balance comes as we integrate contemplation with action. There's a purification of our action in the world, so it's more fine-tuned. It's less disparate and more concentrated as we get more and more aligned with who we are in God and how to cooperate with God in God's particular will for us.
So it's almost like a life of activism, or a life of pure activism, has its downsides, in that if we are focusing on activism, then we are ending up destroying ourselves, destroying the other people around us, even when what we're trying to do is we're trying to help other people around us. And from what I hear you say, that centering prayer or contemplation helps provide a balance to that. It provides a healing, so that way a person can do the activism.
Yes, and be more effective in the long run.
Okay. So how is contemplative prayer a reflection of loving other people then?
How is contemplation a reflection of helping other people? So the way I see it is that when I take time for contemplative practice, I am taking responsibility for myself. And the more responsible I can be with myself, the more I have to offer in terms of like offering my best self to others. So in that way, it is an act of love, because I am taking responsibility for myself. It is the thing about contemplation is that contemplation over time reveals our unconscious motivations. So why are we doing what we're doing? And in my life, what I came to see was that I had this strong drive to do in the world in a way that would like I was operating in the world primarily for what I thought other people wanted or needed from me. It doesn't sound too terribly bad on the surface, but what it meant was that I was not free to live my most authentic self, because it might risk someone's disapproval of me, or it might risk me not being able to meet someone's need. And those kinds of unconscious motivations are what eventually lead to things like burnout, or toxic relationships or causing more harm than good, even in our best intentions to do good in the world. And so this kind of waking up to those unconscious drives and motivations is critical, so that we can take responsibility for ourselves and not blindly exploit other people for this kind of selfish drive or selfish motivation that we didn't realize was at play. So it's critical that we find a way to take responsibility for ourselves so that we can love others with no strings attached.
Okay, so let's say you're gonna. We've got about 5 minutes here. I figure that's enough. Why don't you teach me how to do contemplative prayer? How to do that right now? I mean, 5 minutes is plenty. Or at least give me a few steps. What would be a first few steps that you would say? Okay. To a person that, okay, I've never done this before, and it sounds a little hokey, sounds like I'm going a little far into Buddhism or something. What exactly is this? What are some of the steps that you would recommend a person who's just starting out with this?
Sure. So my contemplative prayer of choice is centering prayer. And this way of praying is a non-conceptual prayer practice, meaning that unlike other forms of prayer, we're not going to be concerned about concepts, images. We're not going to be concerned about feelings or emotions. We're not doing this practice to experience something. The practice is a practice of letting go, of learning how to trust God. And the fruit of the practice, the experience, if you will, then is in our active life. We start to see the change. And the steps are very simple. You find a posture that allows you to be upright, attentive. You have a sacred symbol. That could be a word, a phrase, like a real brief phrase. It could be an image or simply the breath, conscious, mindful breath. And what this symbol is your symbol to consent to God, or your symbol to consent to love if people have problems with God language. So it's this practice over time of building muscle memory of consent or surrender, saying yes to God, saying yes to love. So then as you sit, you establish your sacred symbol. And this is something that you don't want to switch each time, but you have it each time. It's the same one each time you sit. So it may take some time to determine what it is. But say your sacred symbol is the word love. You sit, you invoke love as your symbol to consent, to say yes to God. So you invoke that symbol, and then you sit in silence and you wait. And what happens inevitably is that you have lots of thoughts and you have perhaps some feelings popping up here and there. And it's quite difficult to sit still in silence in this inner solitude. But this is the practice, this is the work. So as you become aware that you're getting caught up in your thoughts, your feelings, your ideas, your sensations, then you just return in the silence to your sacred symbol. And so in this way, you may be doing this over and over and over again, but you just return very gently. Every time you notice yourself getting all caught up in your mental activity, you return to your symbol. And in this way, you are practicing consent over and over and over again, so that in your daily life, when the challenges come, when the frustrations come, when the pain and the suffering comes, you have developed this greater capacity to be with what is and to say yes to God, to consent to God, to find God in that situation, in your life circumstance. And we teach people to work up to 20 minutes for a sit, but that can be quite difficult in the beginning. So maybe you do it for 5. Maybe then you work up to 10, and eventually try and get to 20 minutes because it takes a good 10 minutes for the nervous system to begin to settle down in such a way that we can interiorly rest in God, which for the first 1,200 years of Christianity, this is what we understood contemplation to be, just simply resting in God.
Mm. And so, and so if a person isn't able to get to 20 minutes or whatever, then they don't need to feel guilty about that. You take as long as you can, and then you can work up over a period of time.
That's right.
Do you do that? I mean, your practice, you've been practicing this for a long time, but if somebody is starting, would you recommend that they practice it one time a day, or how often do you think?
Yeah, I think in the very beginning, it's advisable to begin with one sit a day and work up to the point where you can sit for 20 minutes each day. Then, if you really take to this practice, if you feel like it's calling to you, that you're really drawn to it, then work up to 2 sits a day, maybe one in the morning and one in the evening or afternoon, where you're sitting each time for 20 minutes.
Well, I know that you've got to get going, and I don't want to take them. I really recommend to everyone, just get the book Mindful Silence. There's so much in that book that we didn't get a chance to talk about. There's other experiences that Phileena talks about in her life, and other kinds of ideas of experiencing or of living while dying and other things like that. I just really recommend this book, and that people should rush out right now to Amazon or wherever you get your books and pick up this book. Thank you so much, Phileena, for talking with us.
You're welcome. And it might be helpful for listeners to know that there's a different contemplative practice for each chapter. So if people are interested in this, but they might not be interested in centering prayer, there are other practices that they can learn about.
And there are practical things at the end of each chapter so that to help a person get into that spiritual practice. Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, definitely. This is, I'm going to keep looking at this book for a while, and I think that I'd recommend it to others too. Anyway, thank you so much, Phileena.
Thank you, Steve.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at MennoNerds.com. It's the hub for all things MennoNerds. From there, you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now, there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have 2 options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out MennoNerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.